Okay, thank you, Erwin, for that wonderful introduction. Can you have that? Yeah. Thank you. And I appreciate Erwin kneeling down and praying and leading us in prayer. I read a story one time about Ellen White when she was at a large gathering and she was the speaker, and a young man came up to give the opening prayer, and he started to pray while he was standing. And Ellen White, sitting back there, she says, "On your knees, young man." And the man just, rebuked, and he knelt down and started to pray. And, when we come before the creator of the universe, as much as possible, that's what we should be doing, right? Kneeling before our creator. Let's see here. Let me get this up. All right, this evening, I think, is the last of the 5-part series. I think we have 5 professors in the natural science department, and I'll be the last one speaking from the natural science department. But the whole series that Pastor Don has been giving us is Truth Matters, right? And so in the Friday nights, we're spending 5 nights looking at the second book of nature and seeing what we can learn from science that tells us that truth really does matter. In Genesis 1:1, you know this by heart. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Just simple words that just flat out tell us God is the creator, we are the creature. Truth matters, and origin stories matter. If you believe that you are descended from an ape or reptiles or fish or primordial molecules, if you act like a monkey, because you believe you descended from monkeys, you might be forgiven for that. But if you believe that you are a descendant of Adam, who was made in the image of God, you have a high and lofty legacy to live up to, right? It makes a difference what you believe. Truth does matter. And Dr. Celestine last Friday evening, I really enjoyed his talk, and he started out with the origin story of his background, right, where he grew up and how he came to know the Lord and all that. And I thought I'd share a little bit with you about not necessarily my origin story, but my parents' origin story. And after that, I'd like to transition into a little bit about anatomy and physiology. But both my parents are from Okinawa. Well, you can hardly see that. There's a little dot way down. Let's see if I can, does my pen work here? There it is. That little dot is where Okinawa is. And it's like an island 70 miles long and an average of 7 miles wide. It's a really small, tiny little island, but it's a beautiful place. Tropical, semi-tropical beaches. We were there this past summer and swimming everywhere, and just beautiful, beautiful fish, like swimming in an aquarium. You have all the little fish there with you, and just a great, gorgeous place. This is a lot of resort hotels just line the area now, and that's in Japan. It's known as the Hawaii of Japan, and a lot of tourists come to Okinawa during the summertime. It can get pretty hot and humid, but a lot of tourists still come there. Okinawa is also famous for karate, and you maybe know, this is just a fictional tale, but what was his name? Mr. Miyagi, teaching karate. Karate was originated in Okinawa when the Japanese invaders took away all the Okinawan weapons. They had nothing to fight with, so they started using their bare hands, and that's what karate means, bare hands. It's a fighting technique that they use there. Interesting, when I was researching for this study here, Pat Morita, who plays Mr. Miyagi, when he was 2 years old, he contracted spinal tuberculosis. And they said he spent the next 9 years, from 2 to 11 years old, he spent at Weimar, California, recuperating from that spinal tuberculosis. So back in the 30s, 40s, he was walking around on this very campus. Kind of interesting. But Okinawa is also famous for this guy. This is a real story. Hacksaw Ridge, recently made into a movie, but Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist, the only conscientious objector who received the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's the highest honor that the armed forces can give to one person. and the only conscientious objector who got that medal. So a lot of different things happened in Okinawa. Of course, as Erwin mentioned, it's also known as one of the 5 blue zones that have been identified in the world, some of the highest concentrations of centenarians, 100-year-olds in the world, there in Okinawa. And this is my great aunt. She passed away, how many years ago, Mariko? About, was it like 2-3 years ago, something like that? Yeah, but she was 105 years old when she passed away. When we visited her last, she was 102 years old and still very strong. She had eyesight. She didn't need reading glasses. She would read her Bible every day, her little Japanese Bible. She would memorize every Sabbath when they had church service. In Japan, a lot of times they call for who's memorized their Bible verse. It's not just for little kids. It's for everyone. And she would always be up there. I memorized it. 102 years old, and she would be raising her hands. And had better eyesight than I did. But this is my mom and dad, my sister, brother-in-law, and my family. My father, mother are both 82 years old now, and he's probably busier than I am. He's a retired pastor, but still does Bible studies all over the island. Has an internet ministry where he puts religious videos on YouTube, and he's getting a really good response there in Japan. But I'd like to tell you the story of my mom and dad, how they grew up. It's a tale of 2 cities. Naha, the capital city where my mother grew up, and Kijoka. It's not a city, it's more a village where my father grew up. And Naha is located way down south here. Most of the population of Okinawa is located on the southern end, and Naha is the capital city there. And this is kind of what it looks like now. Of course, it wasn't like this before, just before the war, but it still was the most populous place in Okinawa there. My father grew up on the opposite side, way up here on the northern end of Okinawa. And there, very little population. Even today, it looks like this. Beautiful fields and valleys, little mountains here and there. And just a few years ago, this is what it looked like. Of course, back then, this is what it looked like. Shortly before the war, traditional construction there. And these ladies are making a traditional cloth out of banana plants, banana fibers. And they make a beautiful cloth. They dye it, and it's a specialty of that village that my dad grew up in. I think it's the only place in Okinawa now that they still make that by hand. And just traditional farmers. My grandparents were farmers there, and but then of course, a little while later, when my parents were like school-age children, World War II came on the scene, right? And Okinawa was the site of one of the heaviest fighting in the Pacific theater there. And this is a map of the invasion plan that the American forces had. And the ships came in right about here, and most of the troops went down south where the population was most concentrated, and later on a few of the troops went up north. And during this 82-day-long battle, they say about 100,000 Japanese troops were killed, maybe about over 12,000 American troops were killed, and somewhere between 40 and 150,000 civilians on Okinawa passed away during this horrendous battle. And if you can see this is one of the bays there in Okinawa, and they say my mom remembers seeing some of this, that the bay was just filled with American warships. And they were just, before anyone ever landed, they were just shelling that whole island. And I remember when I was a little kid, I was like 13 years old when we went back to Okinawa, and the site where the Adventist Medical Center is there. We had a little home right beside the medical center, and in our garden, if you dig up any little patch of ground there, you dig up little, rifle shells, just littered all over the place, even decades later. And every once in a while, you'll hear about unexploded bombs that are still found in the jungle. And you find one, you have to call the authorities, and they come in, and because one jolt and might might go off. And so it's a tremendous amount of fighting that went on there. And my mother's family, when they were there, had a horrendous experience. Their home was taken over by the Japanese army, and they had to provide beds for the wounded soldiers that came in. And my mother remembers, these wounded soldiers just crying and just moaning during the night as they were there lying all crowded in their small home there. Soldiers came in, mostly down toward the south, and just heavy, heavy fighting. And this is where, at one of the ridges there, Desmond Doss pulled, as they had to take over the top of that ridge. And they were just getting mowed down because the Japanese army was just entrenched on top of that ridge. And whenever anyone tried to come up over that ridge, they were just sitting ducks. Bang, 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 just kill them all. And they weren't able to get up there until Desmond Doss and a few others of his platoon put this rope ladder up on that ridge, and they stormed the place. And Desmond Doss was one of the guys. He would never carry a gun, ever, during his time in the war. But he served as a medic, and he would help both Japanese soldiers and American soldiers, just bandaging up and helping anyone that he could. And during that day, when they took this ridge, Desmond Doss pulled back from the soldiers that were dead and dying, wounded. He pulled back by himself, they say, between 50 and 100 soldiers, and lowered them down that cliff, down to safety where they could get medical assistance. Desmond said probably about 50. The people in his platoon said no, he did like 100. And so the government, when they gave him his medal, said he did 75. Just average it, I guess. Very humble man, but he did a wonderful work there. But my mother, they got on the last ship that actually, civilian ship that left Okinawa, because the mayor of the city, Naha, was a friend of my grandmother's, and he said, Mrs. Tsukayama, my grandfather had already passed away from tuberculosis just before the war, and said, you have children to take care of, you need to get off this island. The Japanese army was saying, everyone needs to stay, we're going to take care of you, no problem, just stay here and we'll protect you. But the mayor came in at night, came to my grandmother and said, you got to get off this island. There's no way we're going to win this war. You and your children need to get off. This is the last ship that's going to the mainland, evacuating to the mainland. And the story of how they got on that ship and how they escaped to the mainland, that's another story that takes too long. But they had a horrendous experience. My father, on the other hand, lived way up on the north side, and this is what it kind of looked like back then. There were farmers, and just like Dr. Celestine's waterfall, they had waterfalls, they had plenty of water, they had plenty of food. The people down south were starving to death. There was no food. Up north, they were mostly farmers. They had, everything that they needed, water. My dad said he actually enjoyed his time during the war because there was no school. And so he could be at home all day. And he said every once in a while they'd sound the sirens when there was airplanes flying overhead. And so they would just scamper off into the jungle and hide for a little bit and then come back out and play all day. And they had food, and he said, it's great. Someone had the forethought. They spread the rumor to the people down the south. They said, the north is just terrible. There's no food there. There's sickness there. Don't come up north. It's just as bad as the south. And so there was this rumor that spread down the south, and not many people came up to the north side. And so my dad said, he had a great time. One of the main crops that they have in Okinawa there is this purple potato, sweet potato. Very, very nutritious. Yeah, it's really good. It's not like the yams that you have here. Much better. These purple sweet potatoes, but highly nutritious. And this is what probably saved a lot of people's lives because of this potato that they had. Then, shortly after America won the war, the GIs would come through their village up north there, and they'd be handing out candies, chocolates and chewing gum. And my dad, would go out there when the GIs were coming through with their jeeps and go out there and wave and all that, and they would be throwing out gum and candy. And he said he had a great time during the war. And you would think in a small, tiny little island like Okinawa, 70 miles long, 7 miles wide, where you lived in that horrendous war should not have made that much of a difference, right? That whole island should have gone up in flames. But because my mother's family was living in the city, they had a terrible, terrible experience. My father, because he was living way out in the country, he actually enjoyed his time during the World War II. And over 100 years ago, there was a little old lady that said, whenever possible, it is the duty of parents to make homes in the country for their children. Get out of the large cities as fast as possible. You know, my parents weren't Adventists back then. Adventism came into Okinawa after the war. Actually, my grandmother's uncle was the first Seventh-day Adventist to come into Okinawa, and he sought out his niece, who was my grandmother, and my grandmother became the first Adventist convert on Okinawa. But this little old lady, Ellen G. White, over 100 years ago, said, get out of the cities as fast as possible. There are people who say, you know, Ellen White was, you know, a good person, but a lot of her teachings, you know, good principles, but they're like vestigial platitudes. Remember those two words? I like that word, vestigial platitudes. I think Pastor Don used that last week. Vestigial platitudes. They might have been okay at some point, but now, you know, it's out of date, useless. We don't need that anymore. There are many other quotations from Ellen White that people consider as vestigial platitudes. But when God speaks through his servants, is there such thing as a vestigial platitude? No, there are eternal principles. Eternal principles. They might need to be, you know, interpreted for our times, but they are based on eternal principles. And when God says, we better listen. Yes. Now I want to switch a little bit over now to anatomy and physiology, because that's where I teach, and a few thoughts from there. And we'll first talk about vestigial organs. You've heard about vestigial organs? The term was, they think, Charles Darwin was probably one of the first scientists who used that word. And vestigial organs refers to rudimentary, atrophied, aborted organs that, you know, we don't need them anymore because as we evolve, we don't need certain organs, structures anymore. And Darwin himself, in his book, The Descent of Man, says there's at least, let's see, a dozen of man's anatomical features that are useless now because we're so evolved. The muscles of the ear, the wisdom teeth, the appendix, the coccyx, the tailbone, the body hair, the semilunar fold in the corner of the eye. These were all listed by Darwin as being useless vestigial organs because we've evolved from the time of the apes. And this was very strong evidence to Darwin that we had evolved from primitive ancestors. Now, this guy, German anatomist Robert Wiedersheim, is that how you pronounce it? Expanded Darwin's list. He was a disciple of Darwin, and he said, well, that's a good idea. I think there are 86 organs in the human body, or structures in the human body, that are vestigial, that we don't need anymore. And in his list, he listed a parathyroid gland, pineal gland, pituitary gland, the thymus, the tonsil, the adenoids, the appendix, third molars, the valves and the veins. All of these are useless. Of course, we know all of these organs have been subsequently shown to have useful functions, and indeed, some have functions essential for life. Pituitary gland. What is that? What is that called? What's the nickname for the pituitary gland? The master gland. If you don't have a pituitary gland, you die. But back then, they didn't know better, and they said, oh, vestigial. That little thing sitting in the middle of your head, you don't need that. How many of you here have your tonsils, still have your pharyngeal tonsils? Oh, a good number of you. But I'll bet some of you older folks don't have your tonsils. When I was younger, I would get colds all the time and different things, and my tonsils would just swell up all the time. And when my mom took me to the doctor says, you don't need those tonsils, let's just take them out. But my mom said, well, it's okay, we'll take care of them at home. And she never let the doctors operate on me. Thank God for that, because now we know what? Your tonsils are very much a part of your immune system. They're kind of the gatekeepers for everything that comes into your mouth. They're kind of the first lymphoid organs that sense those things. So yeah, you can live without them, but you're much better off if you still have them, right? So now the doctors don't routinely remove the tonsils anymore. So thankfully, the younger generation, it seems like you still have your adenoids intact. What about the appendix? For many, many years, the medical profession has said the appendix, you don't need them. And I've heard of doctors who would open up the abdomen for other reasons, and then they say, well, since we've opened up and we're here anyway, let's just cut out the appendix because it's going to cause problems for you later on anyway. And even if it was a perfectly good appendix, and just because they were there, let's cut it out. Is that true, that the appendix is a vestigial organ that has no use in the body today? Not at all. Of course, if it does get inflamed, if it's about to burst, yeah, that is a medical emergency that needs to be taken care of. Maybe you do need to cut that out. But again, like the tonsils, as much as possible, it is an immune tissue, and important functions reside there. And this article I came across a little while ago. There may be even more use for the appendix than we had thought. Biofilms in the large bowel suggest an apparent function of the human variform appendix. This research group said that the microbiome in your gut, we're learning more and more that the bacteria that live in your gut, very important for good health, right? And when you have like a massive diet, maybe you have an infection or something and you have massive diarrhea and you just blow out all of your microbiome in your gut, they say the appendix will serve as a safe house for these healthy bacteria to stay in until the storm blows over. And then when the storm is over, then they come back out and repopulate your gut. And if you have your appendix, you can much more quickly repopulate your gut, and you're much more healthier that way. So a novel idea that people hadn't even thought of until 2000. I think this paper was written in 2007. Yeah. All right. So all this talk about vestigial organs reminds me of this story about the farmer and his young son who were walking around their large farm one day. The ears of corn were growing really nicely and tall and beautiful, and awaiting a good harvest. They saw their wheat fields just golden, drying out, and really nice there. They went through the pumpkin patch, nice large orange pumpkins lying around on the field. And as they were walking around, they got tired, so they went to this oak tree, and both the little boy, and the farmer sat down under that oak tree to rest a little bit. And so while they were there resting, the little boy more about maybe one of the smartest persons that ever lived, right? He singled out the hearing ear and the seeing eye as proofs in our body that God is our creator. And it's interesting, I don't, just the hearing, the mechanism of hearing, pretty complicated and complex, and but I don't have any materials that I can bring proving the creator God from that point yet, but the seeing eye, that one has bothered me for quite a while, because before I do that, before we go into vision, the eyes, just the tears. You think that tears, that should be simple enough to comprehend, just a liquid maybe with a bit of salt dissolved in it. But just looking at the tears come in layers. There's actually 3 layers to tears as they go across your eyes. That first layer is a lipid layer The middle layer is a watery layer, and that third layer is a mucus layer, and they all have important functions within your eye there. That top layer with the oil is there so that it doesn't evaporate too quickly. You need that oil layer in the very front. And that middle layer is aqueous, where some of the nutrients are dissolved in so that the eye can be, the cornea can get its nutrients, because there's no blood vessels running through your cornea, right? If you did, the whole world would look pink. That might be a good thing, but I don't know. No blood vessels there, so it needs nutrition from your tears to get that in there. And then that last layer is a mucus layer that helps the whole tear complex to stay adhered to the eye. And so just a simple thing like tears, when you look at it, it's actually fairly complex. And we think this all came about by chance. So the vision, though, this has bothered me for quite a while, because while I was in Walla Walla, one of my biology students, not students, I was still a student back then, one of my biology professors challenged us with this question. He says, the structure of the eye is actually inverted. It's completely against, logical thinking. And so he says, I don't know how to explain it. Maybe you guys, if you go on to medical school or whatever, and if you learn something that explains why God did it this way, let me know, because I can't explain it. And what he was talking about is that, the sensory apparatus of the eye, where we actually see light, where the light is sensed, is way back in this layer here. The rods and the cones that we talk about are way back here. Light comes in from this area, and it has to go through this whole jungle of ganglion cells, bipolar cells, amacrine cells, horizontal cells, before the light rays hit the rods and the cones way in the back. And you would think, if you want good eyesight, you want to catch as many of the photons coming in your eyeball as possible, right? So why not put the sensors up front here and have all the apparatus behind it? Because that's exactly what the octopus has. The octopus has all of its sensors right up front here. As light comes in, the first thing it hits is those optical sensors. And then the cellular apparatus is all in the back here. Whereas in the humans, it's completely the opposite. It has to go through all this junk, so-called junk, before it hits the sensors way in the back. Why did God do that? Another reason why this seems such a backward engineering is because if you have the cell structure in the front and the sensors in the back, as the nerves exit the eyeball, you have this section here where you don't have any sensors right in there. And hence we all have a blind spot in our eye, right? In both of our eyes, we have a blind spot where we don't have any light sensors. And it's totally blind right there. How come we don't see little black holes everywhere we look? It's because our brains have been wired so that it just automatically fills in that black spot there. But you can test this yourself. There's little cards that you can look, and if you focus it just right, that little mark on one of the cards will completely disappear. No matter how hard you look, it's gone. And so our brains are automatically filling in these little black spots in our vision. But why would God design it in such a backward way? It seems very counterintuitive, right? And my biology professor at Walla Walla couldn't figure it out, and said, maybe when you go to med school, they'll explain it to you. I don't think they addressed it in med school. But one day, when I was sitting in radiology class, X-ray class, how to interpret X-rays, they were talking about the apparatus that they use to take X-rays. And they were talking about this lead plate that they put just in front of the X-ray film. Of course, now we don't use film. They have sensors now. But is Sal here? I think I talked to, no. I talked to him a little bit before this, and I guess they don't use these plates anymore. They have a computer way that they can use it now. But back then, they had these plates that was made of lead, really fine mesh of lead. And they would place this lead mesh on top of the X-ray film as they were taking the X-ray of the patients. And you would think, with the X-rays coming in through the body, just like, in our eye, you would want all the X-rays to get through so that you can get the clearest image on that plate. But they put this lead mesh right on top of the film, and they said it was because you don't want any X-rays that have been deflected by the body. You only want the X-rays to come through that travel straight through the body. If it hits bone, they want it to completely go away and not get deflected and come in at a weird angle. Because if it does that, what happens is, without the grid, this is the image you get. But if you have that lead grid on top of the film, it looks much sharper because all those stray, X-rays that have deflected when they hit the bone, they get eliminated by that lead mesh. So even though you use the same amount of X-rays, by putting that lead mesh on top of the film, you get a much clearer picture. And I thought, wow, maybe that's one reason why God put that whole network of cells in front of the sensors in our eyeball. It could be. I haven't seen any research papers on that, but that was just a thought that came to me while I was sitting there in radiology class. But, there's another reason. Fiber optic cables. You know about fiber optic cables, right? They transmit light pretty much 100% accuracy without any loss of power or clarity. Some new researchers say there are cells in the retina that act like fiber optic cables. They say there are these cells called Mueller cells. Here are the Mueller cells, and they have a little funnel-like shape at the top, and they channel light all the way down through this whole jungle of cellular mass, and then they direct the light right onto the rods and the cones. Isn't that fabulous? And it acts just like fiber optic cables. They transmit that light through all that jungle of cells right onto the rods and cones. The interesting thing is that not just that, the top portion is a little bit wide like a funnel so that it can catch as much light as possible, but then it funnels it into one rod at the bottom, one cone for color vision at the bottom. But on the periphery are the rods that are important for night vision, right? So if you're funneling all that light just onto the cones, you get good daytime vision, but if no light can fall on the rods that are around there. So they're wondering what happens with that. And they found that these fiber optic cables, all the, let's see here, the color light, let me just show you here. The higher energy blues, violets that are important for night vision, it actually leaks out of that fiber optic cable and hits the rods surrounding that cone. While the lower frequency, the reds, yellows, more important for daytime vision, that gets phoned directly onto the cones. So it's like a really fancy fiber optic cable where it knows to let the night vision, photons leak out so that it can hit the rods, but the detailed color and all the light that comes in daytime, it just focuses right on the individual cones. So does God know what he's doing? It's only because of our puny brains that we always think, why in the world did God do it this way? One more thing here. There's this nerve called the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. It starts out from the base of the brain here. It's part of the vagus nerve, one of the cranial nerves that comes out of the brain. It's a large nerve that comes out this way. But then a little branch called the left recurrent laryngeal nerve branches off of the vagus nerve, loops around the aortic arch here, loops around, goes back up the throat, and finally innervates the larynx in here, where it's important in voice production, coughing, controlling the muscles in your larynx here. And all the evolutionists look at this and say, "Whoa, here it is. See, that's terrible engineering. If I was an engineer, I would never, do it like that. Why don't you just go right from here and innervate right into the larynx where it's supposed to be? You just a couple of inches there. Why go all the way down here and do it that way? It's just ridiculous. And so let me just show you this film clip of Richard Dawkins. He's the famous evolutionist, making fun of creationists all the time.
There's a nerve called the recurrent laryngeal, which runs from the brain, and its end organ is the larynx, and you think it would just go straight there. But in a human, what it does is goes down into the chest, loops around one of the main arteries in the chest, and then goes straight back up again. Obviously a ridiculous detour. No engineer would ever make a mistake like that.
Ridiculous. No one would do that.
In our bodies, the laryngeal nerve takes a circuitous route. But what happens in an animal with a neck as long as this? It's one of the great evolutionary enigmas that Richard Dawkins is keen to resolve in the flesh.
Interestingly, it's never been dissected out, or only once before has it ever been dissected out in its full length, and that was in 1838.
Don't cut it at this crucial moment.
Oh, well, I'm too good an anatomist for that. You have to trust me now. What I'm actually holding here is the beginning of that nerve. It actually starts out not as a separate nerve, but as a branch coming off of a bigger nerve called the vagus nerve. And this is going to keep running all the way down the body. So you'll see it again over here, all the way down the neck on both sides. So you can see it again right there.
Yes.
And this is going to wrap around the great vessels coming out
Sorry,
of the
those
heart.
of you who aren't in cadaver
So here it
lab.
is wrapping around that, and then it continues right there. So here's the vagus going down, and here's the vagus continuing.
Right.
And right over here, there's a branch right there. So it's looping and it's coming back, it's doing a U-turn all the way down here. So it's traveled that entire distance to make a U-turn to go all the way back up again. And so now we can follow it going back up again. So we follow this branch, and if we look, we see it again over here. Here it is, like that. And here you see it going up. This is the voice box, the larynx, and so you can see it going right into the back of the larynx here. And as it innervates this area, it controls the muscles that then control making sounds, but also coordinating breathing and swallowing in this area. So this is a very important nerve. Interestingly, where it ends is pretty close to where it started. It started here, coming out of the brain. It really only needed to go about 2 inches.
Yes, amazing.
But it went all the way down and came all the way back.
Yes. That's a beautiful example of historical legacy as opposed to design.
Exactly. This is not an intelligent design. An intelligent design would be to go from here to here.
Yes.
It does kind of beg the question, though, that even in an animal that might have been many millions of years ago with its head down here, why the route round the blood vessels, unless there was a reason that they were there to innovate something else?
Well, that was in earlier ancestors. Then it was the most direct route in fish.
So it's just inherited.
It's a historical legacy.
Fish really don't have much of a neck, so there isn't any extension to worry about in fish. It just goes directly there. Once you introduce a mammalian neck, you start to get a longer neck, now the heart is displaced down lower.
It turns out the laryngeal nerve first evolved in fish-like creatures as a direct link from the brain to gills near the heart. Over millions of generations, this nerve gradually lengthened, each small step always simpler than a major rewiring to a more direct route.
Remember that a designer, an engineer, can go back to
In the world, did God do it that way, where it goes all the way down to the heart, comes back up, and even on the right side, it still doesn't go all the way down like the left side, but still does this circuitous route coming down and coming back up to innervate the larynx. Why in the world did God do that? And there's really not a complete answer at this point. But there was a doctor, a creationist doctor, who made this observation. He said the course of the nerves brings them through the mediastinum, that's the middle part here, where the heart and the lungs meet. There are many lymph nodes there, and enlargement of these lymph nodes from processes such as cancer or infection often irritates these nerves and causes hoarseness or coughing. His idea was maybe because that nerve goes all the way down the chest and back up and innervates the throat, could this be like the the warning lamp on your car. We don't know exactly what's going on in the depths of your engine. Most of us aren't mechanics. But when that light goes on, you know something's wrong and you need to take care of it, right? He says maybe God designed our voice to be like that warning thing, where it travels through some very important structures. And if there's any pressure or abnormalities around that nerve, it'll show up in your voice. Your voice changes. And he says maybe that's why God did that. It reminds me of a story that I gave this talk in Japan this last summer, and my brother-in-law was translating for me, and he got really excited when I told the story because he said, now it explains it. And I said, explains what? And he says he has a neighbor that he hadn't seen for like 2 or 3 months. And when he finally saw him again, he says, oh, Mr. Takeshi, or whatever his name was, good to see you back. Haven't seen in such a long time. And he says, and his neighbor says, oh, Mitsuru, so glad to see you too. And then Mitsuru says, my brother-in-law Mitsuru says, what happened to your voice? And he says, well, I went in for heart surgery, and I was recuperating, and after I got through with the heart surgery, my voice was like this. And Mitsuru could not, they were operating on your heart, right? Not your throat. How come your voice was affected like that, and they were doing heart surgery? And he says, maybe that explains it. They might have nicked it or damaged the recurrent laryngeal or something like that. Could be one of the explanations. So that nerve that goes all the way down to your heart and back up again, there has to be some kind of a reason for that, right? And actually right now, like in MIT and different places, they're trying to come up with a device that will diagnose disease just by the sound of your voice. They say someday you'll be able to just talk into your iPhone like you normally would, and your iPhone will diagnose you. Oh, you might have some heart disease there. You might have some Parkinson's coming on, Alzheimer's, dementia. They're saying Parkinson's, the mid to more severe Parkinson's, they're able to pick it up through your voice pretty quickly, much quicker than if you had to wait until the degree of shaking and all of that usually you diagnose it with. Voice changes. If you can pick it up early enough, you can help a lot of people by starting treatments much earlier. So MIT technology, voice analysis tech, could diagnose disease. Automatic speech analysis for the assessment of patients with pre-dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So, which is the better scientist? The evolutionist who looks at a problem and says, that's just vestigial, historical legacy stuff, it's junk, we don't need it. I can't explain it, so we don't need it. Or the creationist who looks at the same problem and says, what was God thinking when he did this? There must be a good reason. And you start investigating. There must be a good reason, so what is that reason? And I pray that each one of you, as we're all natural scientists, whatever field you go into, you're always thinking, you're always asking questions. When you run up against a problem that you can't solve, don't just say, it's not important. There must be a reason. What was God thinking when he did it this way? There are no unsolvable problems. Only the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Just in closing here, let me just present a few more thoughts here. As we look at nature, we see a clear distinction between the creator and the created. We are created creatures. There's a huge chasm between the creator and the creature. No matter how many eons of years we spend in heaven, in eternity, we will never become God, right? There will always be that divide. Of course, Jesus is the one who crosses that gap and brings us close to God, right? But as creatures and God, there's a huge chasm. No matter how long we spend in eternity, we will never evolve to become God. But there's a philosophy. Well, there are two extremes. Evolutionists say we're descended from monkeys. and human life just came by chance. We're meaningless. Life is meaningless. But then there's the other extreme that says we are actually mini gods. We are gods. And what we think, what we wish for, actually comes true because we create our own reality. Have you heard those words before? Create your own reality? That's one of the main tenets of the New Age philosophy, right? That we're actually gods. And whatever we imagine, whatever we think, if you focus, if you concentrate hard enough, if you meditate hard enough, it will become true. You create your own reality. Meditate, visualize, create your own reality, and the universe will simply reflect back to you. You create your own reality by conjuring within you an emotion that feels good to you. Does reality not matter anymore? You might have heard this story. It was in Spokane, Washington. Rachel Dolezal. She was one of the leaders of the Spokane NAACP. She spoke about racial prejudice and all this. She identified as black, but her parents came out and said, no, that's our daughter. She's white. We're both white. She's white. But she says, well, I feel black. I identify as black. And she had to step down. The courts decided against her and said, even though you feel like you're black, no, you're not black. You need to step down. Just the fact that you think you're black, that you identify as black, doesn't make you black. There's still a reality to deal with. I just saw this recently. Mattel is now marketing a line of gender-neutral dolls because, boys should be able to play with dolls too, right? And so they have this whole line of dolls called the creatable world. You create your own world. You can dress them up as a boy, you can dress them up as a girl. You have, in that whole box, you have both skirts and pants, long hair and short hair. You can be whatever you want to be. Just create your own world. They're starting them that young now. This philosophy of what you think, you just create your own world, it will come to be. You are little gods. Just create your own world, and everything will be fine. We are divine beings. We're just stuck here on earth. We're having a human experience, but we are divine beings. That's the siren call of the New Age philosophy. But it's just a repeat of the original sin, right? I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Who said that? Lucifer, who said, I'm just as good as Christ. I'm the highest of the angels. I should be included in the council that, decided to make this earth. I'm just as good. But there'll always be a huge chasm between creature and the creator. We must never forget that. Does truth matter? It does. It does. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works. Last closing thoughts here. Of course, when God created the world, the universe, he spoke everything into existence, right? He spoke, and there was light. He spoke, and the plants started growing. He spoke, and the world was there. But when he created Adam, he didn't speak, and instantly Adam was there. That's not how he did it, right? He actually knelt down in the dirt, started playing with the dirt, like Play-Doh or something, started forming the bones, forming the muscles, forming the nerves. God created Adam with his own hands. A special order of creation. 8 Testimonies, page 255, it says, before the entrance of sin, not a cloud rested upon the minds of our first parents to obscure their perception of the character of God. They were perfectly conformed to the will of God. For a covering of beautiful light, the light of God surrounded them. This clear and perfect light illuminated everything which they approached. They were perfect. Their minds were fully in tune with that of the Creator. And remember the first task? Well, the first thing that God did with Adam and Eve was he had them rest, right? The Sabbath day. So I guess it was the following Sunday. the first job that God gave to Abraham. No. He had this job on Friday because this was before Eve was created. The first job that Adam had was what? Naming the animals, right? And the Bible says, and out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field, every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. I thought, God brought all the animals to Adam, and he said, what should we call this one? I said, okay, let's call it this one. What should we call this animal? Well, let's call it the giraffe. But I don't think it was that way. Anybody that's worked with computers, I started out when it was, just rudimentary TRS-80 from Radio Shack, programming little computers to play tic-tac-toe. If you've done any computer programming, when you write code, what's the first thing you need to do? See if it works, right? See if there are any bugs in there that you need to fix. So you run the code and see if there are any glitches. God, I don't have any spirit of prophecy or anything for this, so just take it with a grain of salt. But what if God was testing out Adam's brain to see, can Adam think my thoughts? And so he brings this large animal in front of Adam. And Adam looks at it, and that perfect light that shines out from Adam, a part of God's light, illumines that animal. And he looks at it and he says, that is an elephant. An elephant was the word that God used to speak that animal into existence. He looks at another animal and says, that is a giraffe. And that was the word that God spoke to bring that into existence. And he was testing out, can Adam discern my word, my thought in the creation around him? And as he did that, it says, Adam called every living creature, and that was the name thereof. He passed 100%, no glitches in his programming. And I thought, when I first thought about this, I thought, oh, that's a pretty good original thought. But I came across this statement by A.T. Jones. And A.T. Jones, if any of you have read A.T. Jones, he is so eloquent. He can put those words together like nothing. And so here's how he puts it. He says, think of the wonderful mind and faculty of the man who by a look could read the essential nature of each creature and of the whole creation, and could speak the word that expresses the thought of that essential nature and characteristic. This word which the man spoke, defining each, was but the reflection of the word of God, which had produced each. This tells that the man was so at one with God in spirit and will and mind that at sight he could read correctly the thought of God in creation and could exactly express that thought in the Word of God. It shows that the mind and faculty and the spirit of the man were truly but the reflection of the divine mind and spirit. Isn't that wonderful? Adam was so in tune with God, his thoughts, that as soon as he saw creation, he could sense and he could express that word which God spoke, which God used to speak that into existence. Who is among you? Let's see. Is it going to come out? Last few slides here. Who is among you that feareth the Lord, that obeyeth the voice of his servant, that walketh in darkness and has no light? Let him trust in the name of the Lord and stay upon his God. When we run into a problem that we don't know what the answer is, it sounds like the evolutionists maybe have a point there. Don't lose hope. God knows what he's doing. He did it for a purpose. And it says if you're walking in darkness and you don't have light, let him trust in the name of the Lord and stay upon his God. Don't give up. God knows what he's doing. The very next verse says, behold, all ye that kindle a fire, that compass yourselves about with sparks, walk in the light of your fire and in the sparks that you have kindled. This shall ye have of mine hand. You shall lie down in sorrow. What that tells me is that, when we're walking in darkness, don't try to light your own candle. Don't try to go off and start your own fire and see what you can do. We need to wait and trust in the Lord your God. Because if you start walking in the light of your own fire, and the sparks that you have kindled, God says you shall lie down in sorrow. The end is not pleasant. Last quote here. God's Amazing Grace, April 11th. It's a devotional that Ellen White quotes. When temptations assail you, when care, perplexity, and darkness seem to surround your soul, look to the place where you last saw the light. Rest in Christ's love and under his protecting care. If you feel like you're walking in darkness, don't lose hope. There are no unsolvable problems. God has the answer. He's in control. If you're in darkness, try to look for the last place where you saw the light. Go back to that place, and God will bless you. Thank you so much for listening, and may we each walk in God's light and not in the sparks of our own imagining.